Hello, I'm Michael McMullan. Welcome once again to the WPBSA official podcast. And this is a special episode because, as I'm sure you know by now, one of the most celebrated and indeed decorated names in the game's history, Ray Reardon, has passed away at the age of 91. And we obviously couldn't let the occasion go by without talking about Ray's extraordinary life, his contribution to the game, and the sort of man and sort of player that he was. And we have a very full house today because we've got two of the stars of the era that I think Ray paved the way for, really, with his domination of the game early on in its TV era, Jimmy White and Neal Foulds. And all the best known and most respected voices in the game, television commentators Dave Hendon and Phil Yates. Well, let's start with you, Neal, because I'd like to ask you about Ray's influence on young players growing up at the time that you were a youngster. Was Ray the model that everyone looked up to and wanted to emulate at that time?
Yeah, I think he was. He was the one. I mean, if you look at professional snooker when I was growing up, I mean, I knew Ray through my dad's influence in the game before I was ever a professional. It was almost, you so much looked up to the way that Ray was the true professional. He was immaculate. He was slightly scary, like your headmaster kind of thing, but to be respected. But he was a great man. He was a model pro. That smile he had, sometimes there was more to the smile with him. Just the way he conducted himself. He had his own mind. Let's be honest about it. He had his own way about things. It wasn't as if you look at his association with O'Sullivan. I'm sure we're going to come to that, but in a way, they were quite similar, more similar than what you think. Ray wanted things done his own way, and he would give you great advice. He'd say it once, and if you didn't hear it, you'd have missed it. But Ray was the model professional and someone you couldn't help but look up to. He had an aura about him and an incredibly special man in snooker.
Well, Jimmy, you're pretty much the same age as Neal, that era as well. How aware were you of Ray and what a big figure he was when you were a teenager learning the game?
Yeah, well said. What Neal just said, I emulate that. He had that present about him. He was a class act on and off the table. He did smile sometimes during a match and all that, but he had full focus. He worked down the mind. So, he had quite a life before he became a sort of full-time professional snooker player. But he was always very, very good to me. We had a lot of good times together. And I think he was the missing link for O'Sullivan that made O'Sullivan this winning machine that has become, because Ray made him enjoy the tactical side. But I remember Ray Reardon coming into Pot Black in Bardens Road when we was very young, me and Tony Mio, and he was doing a KP peanut advert just before the Masters. And, the presence of the man and all about him. He was very smartly dressed. He always had time for people, and truly missed. He was a really great guy, full of class, and make no mistake, one of the greatest snooker players we've ever had.
Well, Dave, people always talk about Jimmy's great friend Alex Higgins as the first real superstar of snooker's TV age. And in a sense he was, but in another sense, really, Dave, it was actually Ray, because he was the first player who the public really knew as the dominant figure in the game.
Yes, he was the first winner of Pot Black, which of course is a seminal moment on British television for snooker in colour. So he won the first staging of that in 1969. Became the dominant player of the 1970s. And as Neal alluded to, he had very firm opinions on how things should be done in his favour. A lot of those venues in the 70s for the World Championship just were not good enough. They were substandard. There was famously a year where the roof leaked. It was raining in Manchester, had to stop play, all of that. And he was constantly on at the organisers about the standard of the tables, the lighting, putting the players off, the way that the public were allowed to sort of walk around. He wanted it to be more professional. And of course, we ended up at the Crucible. He got his wish. It became more professional. A lot of that was down to him as the dominant figure, not accepting that it was kind of good enough. And that definitely helped snooker's credibility as much as anything. And also, Alex obviously was an amazing figure for the game and brought so much to it, brought so many people to it. But you needed the contrast. You needed the well-behaved one as well, and that was Ray Reardon. I think headmasterly is a good way of describing him. And you could also put him on, for example, it's quite a famous interview now. He went on the Parkinson chat show here in Britain, which was a massive thing on a Saturday night. Spoke very movingly about being trapped in a mine when he was 24. He was trapped for 3 hours, couldn't move, couldn't move a muscle, sort of kept himself, vaguely sane by imagining playing marbles against his brother while he was waiting to be dug out, not knowing if he would be. And I think that incident was obviously very formative in the rest of his life. He had a very much a zeal for life. I was very fortunate to interview him just last year, and he had that glint in his eye then, was someone who enjoyed company, enjoyed telling stories about his career, enjoyed being around people. And it's great to think that actually he did have that enjoyment, because it could all have come to a very sad end, much earlier.
Absolutely. He lived to a great age. And Phil, we talked there to Jimmy and Neal about what he meant to aspiring young players. And you, of course, are very similar age to both Jimmy and Neal as well. You were growing up in the 70s. I know you were a good player yourself, but no aspirations to be a pro. So you were more of a snooker fan. So what did Ray Reardon mean in those days?
The very first person we saw play was Ray Reardon against Marcus Owen, who was the brother of Gary Owen, who was the better known of the two brothers. And my father talked about him in such reverential terms that whenever we spoke about Reardon, and it was quite a large arena, he could have spoken in a normal voice. It was as though he had to whisper, because he was talking about a god of the game. And I was 14 in 1976. I played him in an exhibition match at Quarry Bank Conservative Club. And back then, very mistakenly, I fancied myself as a really good player. So potted the first red, didn't drop on a colour. So I laid a snooker. It was the worst thing I ever did. He then just humiliated me with a whole string of snookers when he could have played attacking shots, put me in my place, and he made me realise just what a master he was. He was a different breed in the sense, I think Davis hit the nail on the head, because of his life down the mine. And of course, he had 2 bravery awards as well as a policeman. He disarmed a guy with a gun in Stoke City Centre, just went up to the guy, and he was unarmed himself, of course. So he was a very brave person. He had perspective. And although treated as a game in some respects, it was very much his profession. And he was completely and utterly cutthroat. And that's why he was so successful.
Neal, we talked there a few minutes ago about Ray being the first ever winner of Pot Black, which, as we know, was a hugely significant moment in the game's history. You actually played him in Pot Black early on in your professional career. What was it like, Neal, having grown up watching Ray as the dominant figure in the game, to then find yourself, as you did on a number of occasions, actually playing against him?
Well, it was a very different experience. I played him in Pot Black, and I remember it. I was going to mention that actually, but you've already unearthed that game we played. What happened was we were there. It was all played at Pebble Mill. I was now coming through, and I'm now rubbing shoulders with the likes of Ray, which was a big deal. I had played him previously in the Pro-Am in Pontins, which I was going to come to, but they were trying to hurry the matches along because Pot Black was always played over a couple of days. And I was the youngster, and a couple of people at Pebble Mill said, right, Mr. Foulds, okay, we're going to rush you into makeup now. We're going to get you ready for this match. If you don't mind, 2 minutes. And Ray said to me, take as long as you like. Don't be told what to do, he says. He was giving me sound advice, which you take through your life. You're obviously going to do things punctually, but they were just trying to rush me through. They felt that I was perhaps the lesser known of all of them, which is probably true. And he said, no, he'll start when he's ready. You take your time, And of course, I ended up beating him in that match, and the big warm handshake afterwards. I also beat him before that in the Pontins week Pro-Am, which Jimmy will remember that. It was one of those where the 8 invited professionals come through, and I was just about to turn professional, and I had to play Ray in the semi-finals, so I'd won a lot of matches. I'd beaten everybody, and he had to give me 25 points start, and it was on the Friday morning, and in my mind, there was nobody in the world that could have given me 25 point start at that stage in my career, because I was coming through, had to play Ray, and he beat me. He beat me 4-2. He gave me a lesson. He gave the referee, Gus Lillygreen, who was a friend of his, a Welshman, a torrid time over a couple of things. Just wanted the rules to be enforced correctly. He was getting down to play a shot when he was snookered, and he hadn't nominated his colour, Ray, and it looked like he was just about to play the shot. He still hadn't nominated. And Gus Lillygreen, dear man he was, said, Ray, can you nominate your colour? He said, I will nominate my colour when I'm ready, Gus. If I don't, you call a foul. You do your job, I'll do mine. And all I think played a part in the fact that in the end he beat me. Everything was an event to Ray, and I learned a lot from that. And I sat there afterwards thinking, I thought I could play this game. There's a lot more to snooker than just potting balls. And just being around Ray for that experience was something very special. I was a little bit frightened of him, but in a wonderful way. And I found out what a warm person he was later on.
6 times world champion, of course, but I think in recent years we've referred to him more often as the oldest ever ranking event winner. And I think the reason we talk about that is because we know that record is probably going to go in the next couple of years with someone like Ronnie O'Sullivan, John Higgins, Mark Williams perhaps beating it. But Jimmy, when he became the oldest ranking tournament winner in 1982, it was you that he played in the final. Now, I know that's a really, really long time ago, Jim, but do you remember that final at all?
Yeah. I played him in a couple of finals of ranking tournaments towards sort of the end of his career. I think by about 82, 83, he was one of them people that if he didn't think he could win, he wouldn't play. And that's why he sort of stopped playing, quite early for me. He could have carried on for a bit, but he didn't like the way the tournaments were being run. He didn't like that there was so many different tournaments. He preferred it, he wanted the events to be bigger, as Dave said, more prestige, better venues. I did play him once in Bristol in one of where we used to have the qualifying matches, and he turned around and said to me, this is not me. And that was sort of, and he beat me as well. So he's probably what he done to Neal Foulds. He was complaining about everything, but he had that. For me, he was such a class player to watch, and tactically he was never intimidated. When he played Alex Higgins, obviously Higgins had the rowdy crowd. It didn't bother Reardon at all. He was always in his own mindset and his own confidence, and to me, I learned an awful lot playing him and watching him play as a youngster. He was a class act, and off the table as well. I've done loads of exhibitions with him as well, and after, he liked the odd gin and tonic, but he would, he was always very friendly with the public, always had time for me a lot, that you should be honoured that people recognise you. I learned a lot from Reardon. He was, to me, he would truly be missed because he was a class act on and off the table.
Dave, we always talk, don't we, about how difficult it is to make parallel time greats between different eras, and that certainly applies to Ray, because you think of his era ending, I guess, as the dominant figure with that last world title in 1978. The game within a decade of that had changed beyond all recognition. But it says a lot about Ray and how good he was in his standing in the game's history, Dave, that he lasted so long as a force, really throughout most of it, one way or another.
That's right. And also, generation, they didn't have TV to learn from. They didn't have players to watch. He started playing when he was 6. This was before the Second World War. The game wasn't even known then. It was just a bit of a pocket in Wales where he lived. Didn't turn pro till his mid-30s because there was no pro game. So yeah, he had longevity for sure. He beat Steve Davis in the British Open in 1988 when he would have been in his late 50s. He had an aura. That's the thing. Like the guys have said there, like he was always Ray Reardon, if you know what I mean. And again, last year when I saw him, you could see, even if you didn't know he was a snooker player, you could see there was something about him as a person. He had that sort of magnetism about him. It's not easy to compare eras, but he was the best player, obviously, or certainly the most dominant player of his era. And you can't take that away from him.
Phil, I was talking there to Jimmy about 1982 when Ray became the oldest ever ranking event winner. Earlier that year, he was 3 frames away from winning a 7th world title. And you think, we've talked so much about getting up to 6 or 7 in terms of world titles with Henry and O'Sullivan and Steve Davis and their quest to get to those numbers. Ray was 3 frames away from framing snooker history in the modern era in a very different way.
Yes, and he did not lose that 82 final to Alex Higgins. Higgins won it. He played absolutely brilliantly in the closing 3 frames, of course, very famously making a big century to clinch the title. So Reardon wasn't the architect of his own downfall in that match. It was more to do with the inspirational qualities of the Hurricane. Yes, Alex Higgins and Ray Reardon were very different people. But I think Reardon's biggest rivalry was actually with John Spencer. They won 9 world titles between them. And it was a sort of hidden rivalry, if you like. It wasn't like Carter O'Sullivan now or other players who we know about who don't like each other particularly. No one really knew. It was a sporting rivalry, but it was definitely there. And I think it was definitely a motivational factor for both of them.
And Jimmy, you were just a few, one frame away, in fact, from playing Ray in that 1982 World Final. You think how close you were to going through at such a young age. To face him over 4 sessions. Now, that would have been a clash of styles, Jimmy. How do you think that match would have gone in 82 if it had been you against Ray in the final? And more particularly, how do you think you would have approached it? And how would he have tackled the challenge of playing you?
Well, you know, I can't, as Phil said, Higgins played amazing against me, that incredible clearance he'd done. And then, you know, Reardon didn't play bad in that final. You know, he stayed with Higgins. Higgins just produced towards at the end. But, you know, whenever I play Ray Reardon, even if I was playing, you know, I felt that I was playing at my best. He was like sort of a Steve Davis. You never really sort of annihilated him. You know, he was always there or thereabouts, never wrong shots. And I'm sure players like John Higgins and these players coming through, even maybe Selby might have seen quite a little bit of him on videos, because, you know, his tactical side was next to none. And I'm sure Steve Davis, you know, learned a lot from Ray Reardon. I always enjoyed playing Ray Reardon. I can't obviously talk about what might have happened, because it was Higgins that played him in the final, but it would have been an honour. But just to have played him the amount of times I did, and to be around the man, and you know, he just oozed class for me. And you know, it's just it's sickening to think, you know, that he's passed away. But he had a great career, and he done marvellous for our game of snooker.
Neal, we were talking there about trying to compare players from different eras and how different it is. Or how difficult it is, rather. One thing that I think is a bit easier to do, actually, is to reflect on the role that different players have had in terms of shaping the modern game. Now, in terms of the attacking side and the break building, I think there's been nobody really to compare to Hendry in terms of setting the template for what's followed. Maybe, as Jimmy alluded to there, Neal, from the tactical side of the game and how that's developed, perhaps nobody had a greater impact on how that's evolved over the years than Ray.
No, and I think that the other point about all this is the snooker back then. I mean, what Ray Reardon would have been like as a much younger player. By the time I played him, you know, he was not advancing in years, but he was one of the more senior players. As you've heard, he had a job, various jobs before that. Who knows how much his game could have developed in those years if snooker had been bigger. There's no doubt in my mind he was a great tactician. He had an incredible stun game. And if you've seen him play, you'll know what I mean. He had this double pause through the ball. He was just class. Everything about him was class. He would put you on that vault cushion, and that's where you'd stay for the whole match. Basically, that's the kind of player he was, and there's no doubt about it. What he knew tactically was ahead of anybody else at their time. And like you say, I can't think there's too many players since then that have really ever taken it to new levels. Ray knew everything there was to know about the game, all that knowledge to Ronnie O'Sullivan.
Well, with all that in mind, Phil, one thing that always surprised me a bit about Ray was the fact that he never did television commentary. Now, I don't know, maybe you know differently. Before I was watching the game, maybe he did a match or two. But I always thought if he'd wanted to, and if the opportunity had been there, and I guess somebody would have taken him on, that Ray could actually have been a very interesting television commentator. Now, as someone who's been involved in TV commentary for so long, Phil, what do you think of that idea?
I think it would have been a brilliant idea. You know, it's strange how the mind works. Dave rang me up earlier today to tell me the terrible news that Ray had passed away. And I put the phone down and I sat there contemplating the news. And the first thing that came into my mind was, why didn't he do commentary? I don't know why I thought it. There's no rationale. maybe I'm thinking from a commentator's perspective, but I think he would have been absolutely phenomenal. A, because he was witty. B, because he'd got a good knowledge of the game, an unsurpassed knowledge of the game. But I think also because he got such gravitas, and I think that's why Stephen Hendry is held in such high regard now as well. And one of the reasons that Hendry is so good in the commentary box, he's not frightened to offer an opinion. And Ray certainly would not have been frightened, because how can you possibly doubt his credentials? So, yeah, I think it was a really big missed opportunity. Maybe he didn't want to do it. I don't know. But had he wanted to commentate, he should have been given the chance, because I think he definitely would have enhanced the coverage of whatever TV station was covering the game.
Commentary, of course, Dave, is one way for greats of the past to stay involved in the game. That's what Neal have done. But another way that players stay involved in the game when they're own is coaching. And let's come to that now, because it's something that's already in this conversation. 2004, all of a sudden, he's coaching Ronnie O'Sullivan at the World Championship. And I think a big part of that was, I think Ronnie, the Rocky Balboa to Ray's Apollo Creed, I think he just loved the whole idea of this story of Ronnie, who at that stage, of course, was a former world champion, having this other former champion out of retirement almost to help him along and coax him to win the 2004 championship as much as anything, seemed to be buzzing on the very concept of it all.
Yeah, what happened was it was Ronnie's dad who rang Ray originally and said, I think my lad needs a bit of steel in his game from someone who's been there. Can you help him? And Ray said, I will, but he's got to ring me up himself. So about a week later, Ronnie rang him up. Oh, I'd love to get together, Ray. And he said they got together. Ronnie's turned up with 3 friends. And Ray's looked at these 3. He's dismissed 2. He said, you 2 can't stay. The other one, you can stay, but you're not going to speak, right? And straight away, they're all, oh, okay. So this is not just a bit of fun then. This is actually a serious thing. So straight away, he took control. But at the same time, his natural warmth, I think Ronnie really took to. And it was at this time, I think his father was still inside. So it was a bit of a father figure as well, I think, there as well. But someone clearly who'd been there and done it. And he made it fun, actually. He made the sort of tactical sort of sessions fun. And he said by the end, Ronnie was asking when he was practicing, can we do snookers now? Instead of potting the long ones and all the rest of it, can we do snookers? Yeah, it was someone he had on his side during the tournament who had been through that grind himself. And someone else to win it for as well, I think, as well. He wanted to impress him, I think they bonded really well. They're both sort of quite eccentric in a way, both brilliant as well, both big characters. It was a bit of a match made in heaven looking back. And Ray actually said about it, he said it put 10 years on his life. He loved working with Ronnie. Couldn't speak highly enough of Ronnie.
And Jimmy, at the time, people were saying, well, how do you coach Ronnie O'Sullivan? He's just an unprecedented and unique natural talent. So how can even someone like Ray Reardon come along and teach him anything and coach him? I literally can't think, Jimmy, of anyone better to ask this question of then. What do you think someone like Ray could have done for someone of Ronnie's immense talent from a coaching point of view?
Well, I found it, it looked like a bit of a strange combination when it first started. But I spoke to Ronnie the first time I see him at the World Championship with Ray, and he said he had so much fun with Ray on and off the table. It wasn't boring. They didn't just like some of the players will work with the coaches on the practice table and then they will do other things. They ate together, they travelled together. And he used to say that Reardon used to say to him, before the match started, he goes, right, let's open the shop. Let's go to work. It was all about, enjoyment side of teaching Ronnie, to track people. He said that Reardon showed him, safety positions that he didn't know existed. So obviously with Ronnie's ability of being, the greatest player we've ever seen, to show him that side and then from that moment on, he become a complete player, O'Sullivan. He didn't just play a safety shot. He looked to put people bang in trouble. And, there was a time that I think at the end, Ronnie went away from that side of it. And I think because he thought he'd learned all, but when he was with Reardon for that little amount of time, his game for me improved, like 21 points on the safety. He become a different animal altogether.
So do you feel, Jimmy, that even 20 years on, what Ray did with him back in 2004 is still having an impact today on Ronnie's game?
Make no mistake, because, O'Sullivan was all about, you watch him now, he's like a complete player, O'Sullivan. When he plays a safety shot, he puts maximum effort into it. Before, he was just sort of, trying to put them in trouble. But Reardon showed him ways of trapping people, like in 2 or 3 safety shots time, he's going to get the advantage because he's put him in this position first of all. And O'Sullivan, become I say, for me, you got Reardon, Selby, Steve Davis, and O'Sullivan are probably, the 4 best tacticians we've had.
Got to mention John Higgins as well there, of course. I'd say he'd have to enter that category. Yeah.
There's other great players. I'm just talking about, obviously you got to put John Higgins in there as well. But I mean, make no mistake, Reardon, Steve Davis come along. When you speak to Steve Davis, he would tell you that he learnt so much from Ray Reardon, tactical. And once Ronnie O'Sullivan got that part of his game, he was always going to go from strength to strength.
And as Dave said earlier, Steve got literally schooled by Ray in the British Open in '88 when Ray unbelievably beat him 5-0. But Neal, something else we alluded to earlier, Ray had a life before snooker, a working life before snooker. And really, you think of the modern stars of the game, apart from Ray and Terry Griffiths, perhaps, that's not something that's the case at all, because players from a later era were just full-time pros and basically playing all the time from when they were kids. But how much of an impact, Neal, do you feel that had on Ray throughout his career? The fact that he had a very full life, really, and an eventful one, as Phil explained, before he'd even become a pro.
I'm sure that did. I'm sure it made him grateful for everything he had in snooker. He worked, as you heard, down the mines and all of those kind of jobs, and a few scrapes also that Dave mentioned as a policeman. He also worked very hard after his playing career ended, because he had a terrific relationship with the holiday camp circuit, which was a big deal. Jimmy will tell you that if you had a contract to work around all the holiday camps, a Monday to Friday job going to all the Butlins camps around or the Pontins all around the UK, that was quite lucrative. And he had a great way with people. I remember John Virgo telling the story, actually, that Ray was very demanding, because one week Ray was not going to be there. He had a week off, and John Virgo took all of his holiday camps on. And every holiday, because he would stay at the holiday camps while he was there, and then he would work there and he'd move on to somewhere else in the country and stay in the camp. He reckoned every time he got into a bed, there was a door in the bed. And the reason the door was there was Ray had a very bad back. He's a very tall man, and he used to sleep on a very firm surface. So he'd requested a door to be placed just underneath the sheet in the bed. And obviously they hadn't realised that JV was going to be there that week. I thought it was Ray, because he'd made all these demands. He'd done all his obligations. And he was the most consummate professional, immaculately dressed, tremendous with people. And he was a pretty good, he was always selling merchandise. I think that's where Jimmy's got it all from, all of that side of things. And, he was looking after the business, Jimmy.
Listen, I tell you, I played him in the UK once. I won 9-8 on the black. And this guy went to watch the match, film about it called Billy the Kid be the Green Bay's Vampire. And it was a musical. There was quite some stars in it, funny enough. And I played Reardon the whole film. I think Jeff Foulds Neal's dad done the shots for the movie.
That's right.
That's right, yeah.
And he lived in a coffin in the film. And he went to the matches on a sidecar on a motorbike. And it's quite hilarious, really. And I watched the film with Reardon. And, he laughed so much, because even though it was a bit of a Mickey, taking the Mickey, it was also, the two different types of characters that I was and Ray Reardon was. And, Neal saying he slept on had a door in the bed, it just in the coffin in the film.
Fantastic stuff. I think actually that holiday camp scene was a big part of why Ray retired when he did, because he had that to move into. He didn't need to continue playing when he was falling down the rankings. And I think he alluded to the fact that he had such a lucrative holiday camp scene going when he announced that he was retiring from the game. And by that stage, of course, a lot of really good Welsh players had come through. And you look how small a place Wales is, and then you consider how really good players there have been and continue to be today. It's a place that has absolutely punched so far above its weight in snooker terms. And someone said that to me once about 20 years ago. Why are there so many good Welsh snooker players? And Phil, you know, you were around at the time and you were a big part of the amateur scene and you saw it all. That perhaps is the biggest single reason, the fact that there was the role model there, that Ray had come along and achieved so much. And as we've seen in so many sports, once you get one absolute superstar in a sport from a particular country, it tends to pave the way. And we've seen that with Mark Williams, Matthew Stevens, Ryan Day, so many others since then. Ray set all that in motion, Phil.
Absolutely. And Wales have been right at the top of the tree for many, the prime source of that. You know, these days we talk about winning matches at the Crucible occasionally with a session to spare. Wales at the World Team Cup, near where I live in Old Hill in West Midlands, won a final against England with a day to spare.
Yeah.
That's how dominant they were. And of course, Reardon was the captain of that side, together with Doug Mountjoy and Terry Griffiths. And then, of course, you've got the generation coming through now. You know, the best accolade I think you can give to Ray Reardon is that, yeah, okay, he came through in the 1970s, and a lot of people won't have seen him play at his best. When he went to 2004, that World Championship, and we heard that he was going to be coaching Ronnie O'Sullivan, I was highly sceptical. And I'll tell you why. I'm highly sceptical that Ronnie O'Sullivan can learn anything from anyone, let alone a 6 times world champion. But boy, was I absolutely, totally off the mark there. It really soon became apparent that he was giving O'Sullivan some really positive info and massively improving his game. And the residue of that advice continues to this day. Jimmy's quite correct. The shots we see O'Sullivan play, the chances he gives himself because of his safety play, a lot of that, the kernel of that was established in 2004. Now, why do you think he's made all of these centuries? The reason being, he gives himself chances to make them because he puts his opponents in trouble. And one of the reasons for that is because of Ray Reardon's golden advice. He really was a legend of the game, and he was absolutely dominant in the 70s when he got Spencer and Higgins, who were really good players. And of course, towards the end of the decade, Steve Davis as well. And yet he won 6 world titles. I don't think we can overstate just how use that word advisedly, great player, certainly in the top 5 of all time.
And Dave, as we've said, 6 world titles. 1978 was at the Crucible, but he had also won 5 prior to that. And that means, of course, that with this sad news today, this is the passing of the last champion of the pre-Crucible era.
That's right. I was thinking that, actually, yeah. It's the end of an era. Some of the names we've heard there, John Spencer, Alex Higgins, and Ray Reardon, they were the 3, weren't they, in the 1970s, really, who between them made the game what it was, helped the circuit grow, because back then there was only really one tournament, the World Championship. They drummed up the interest. They were all distinct personalities, and the British public, as we know through television, fell in love with them. So it is, it is the end of an era. It's a sad day, but I do think back to the story I told earlier when he was buried in that mine at the age of 24. It's nice to think that he lived to his 92nd year. Just last year, just after he turned 90, he actually made a century. He made a century on a table. Apparently it was a tight table in Torquay as well. So it's nice to think that he had a nice life. When I saw him down in Brixham, you know, he was life president of the Chester Golf Club down there. They all loved him. It was a nice life. And it's nice to think that he had that after everything that he gave to our sport.
Yeah, and, you know, you and I got to meet him, even though by the time we got involved in the game, he was long since retired. But he kept turning up in various guises. He was at the Welsh Open, I know, one year to present the trophy named after him. I met him at the Crucible, which was just such a massive thrill. And just to come finally to you, Dave, on all of this, I watched that interview that you did with him last year. And the thing that struck me was he still seemed incredibly sharp and really full of a desire to live and continue to milk the most out of life, even at such an advanced age. It was really striking.
Very much so, yeah. I mean, we did the interview. It's a room called Ray's Bar. It's named after him in the golf club. And his eyes absolutely lit up when I asked him about Ronnie. You know, he's still very affectionate about him. Mark Williams had actually been down there to play golf with him not too long before. I wasn't that clear, like how in touch he was with the game at that point. But I mentioned Luca Brissell, who'd become world champion. And again, he started talking about that. He said he thought he was a unique player. So still very connected with the game. I remember John Parrott saying to me that he's met two people in his life with levels of charisma that can't be matched, and one was Seve Ballesteros, and the other was Ray Reardon. And that's, you know, that's quite something. But I think if anyone who met Ray would understand what he meant. He was a very charismatic man. You know, he clearly loved the status that he'd earned, and he'll be missed by many. As Phil said, even those who are too young to maybe watch him, they understand his importance to the sport. And the legacy that he's left behind.
Well, Dave, you and myself and Phil, you know, have been so fortunate to have get involved in the game over the last 20, 30 years or whatever, and to make a certain amount of our living out of it. But ultimately, I always say in any sport, it's all about players. So let's leave the last words here to the two players we have with us in this conversation. And I'll come to you first, Neal. Where do you place him among the all-time greats of the game? I know I said earlier it's hard to compare different eras, but give us your best estimate of where he stands in the pantheon of the game's greats.
Well, I agree with Phil. I agree. I think he's in the top five, because I don't think you can just look at the game now. We know of the players now. Ray Reardon, for everything he achieved in the game, for everything he stood for in the game, and how he was truly respected in the game, he's definitely in the top five players of all time. And I think we all owe Ray a great debt of gratitude, given that Pot Black was what really got snooker on the map. And he was very well known in that, very prominent in that. So I think all of snooker holds him in high regard, and we all owe him plenty.
And Jimmy, we'll come find you. You know, it's really been striking today, actually, how much coverage there's been and how high profile this story has been, not just in sports news, but, you know, just in news broadcast and news reports generally. And it just reflects what I was saying earlier, that Ray possibly was the first genuine snooker superstar. And I don't think there are maybe more than 5 or 6 people you could ever say that about. But it's great to be talking to one of them today, Jimmy, because I think people will put you in that category. So let's come to you finally then, for your final summation of Ray and what he meant to snooker and to snooker people.
He was a fantastic player, tactically the best of his time. I think all of these great tactical players who win these big tournaments now have all learnt from Ray Reardon. He made Ronnie O'Sullivan a complete player. But to me, he was a class act on and off the table, and he'd be truly missed. He was a fantastic guy, and I will miss him.
Yeah, I think everyone will. And, you know, it's just so noticeable having this conversation. People of different ages who've had different roles in the game. We all feel that Ray was a big presence in our snooker stories and our snooker lives. And it's been wonderful to share those thoughts today at very short notice with you, Jimmy, Neal, Phil, and Dave. And thanks very much to everyone for joining us. And thanks to you for listening as well. We'll be back with more from the WPBSA official podcast in due course. But for now, let's remember 6 times world champion and snooker legend, Ray Reardon.